Close your eyes for a moment. Not yet. First, I want you to picture something. Picture an island. A mountainous island rising from a sea so deeply, impossibly blue that the ancient poets couldn't describe it without reaching for the color of wine. The peaks are snow-capped in winter. The valleys run with streams fed by sacred caves. Wild herbs, thyme, sage, oregano, perfume the air so intensely that sailors claimed they could smell Crete before they could see it. Now, picture a building. Not a temple, not a fortress, something else entirely. Something that doesn't fit neatly into any category the ancient world offers us. Picture a structure covering 6 acres of hillside, over 1,000 interconnected rooms, staircases that spiral downward 4 stories into the earth and upward 3 stories toward the light, corridors that turn and double back and open suddenly into vast courtyards flooded with Aegean sun, light wells that channel brightness into the deepest interior chambers, drainage systems, functional engineered drainage systems carrying water through terracotta pipes with such precision that modern engineers have studied them with genuine admiration. Picture this building painted. Not the austere white marble that we associate with the ancient Mediterranean. That is a lie, by the way, one of history's great optical illusions. The Greeks painted everything, the Romans painted everything, and the Minoans? The Minoans painted with an exuberance that makes everything that came after look restrained. Red, deep, arterial, sacrificial red, the color of Cretan earth, of bull's blood, of life itself. Blue, not the pale blue of a northern sky, but the saturated, almost electric blue of the deep Mediterranean at midday, the blue that gets into your bones if you've ever stood on a Cretan cliff and looked south toward Africa. Saffron yellow, the yellow of crocuses harvested by the thousands. We know this because they painted it. They painted young women gathering crocuses on the walls of their most sacred spaces, and the saffron those crocuses yielded was worth more than gold per ounce. And white, the white of lilies, of bare plaster, of the sacred horns that crowned every roofline, the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns, repeated so obsessively across Minoan architecture that they become a kind of visual heartbeat. This building is the Palace of Knossos, and it is not like anything else in the Bronze Age world. It is not like the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, those artificial mountains designed to terrify mortals with the power of gods and kings. It is not like the pyramids of Egypt, those geometric declarations of pharaonic immortality. It is not like the citadels of Messene or Tiryns, those paranoid fortresses with walls so thick the later Greeks believed only Cyclopes could have built them. Knossos has no outer fortification wall. Let that sink in.
The greatest palace complex in Bronze Age Europe, the administrative, religious, economic, and cultural center of a civilization that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for over 600 years, had no defensive wall, no moat, no gate towers, no killing ground, no arrow slits, nothing. The palace simply opens. It opens onto the landscape. It breathes. People flow in and out through multiple entrances. The central courtyard, 50 meters long, 25 meters wide, is not a parade ground for soldiers. It is a performance space, a ritual arena, the place where young men and women, if we believe the frescoes, and we will talk about whether we should believe the frescoes, leaped over the horns of charging bulls. Bull leaping. We need to talk about bull leaping, but not yet. First, I want to introduce you to someone. She has no name. Of course she has no name. Almost no one in Minoan civilization has a name we can read with certainty, because the Minoans wrote in 2 scripts, Linear A and Linear B, and Linear A, the older script, the truly Minoan script, remains undeciphered. It is one of the great locked doors of human knowledge.
We possess the symbols, we can see the clay tablets, we can count the inventory marks, recognize the numerical system, identify the commodity signs for wheat, oil, wine, wool, but the language underneath, the actual spoken tongue of the Minoan people, is unknown. It belongs to no established language family. It has no confirmed descendants. It vanished with the civilization that spoke it, and the silence it left behind is one of archaeology's most haunting absences. So she has no name that we can recover, but I am going to call her the Painter, because that is what she was. We know she existed, or someone very like her existed, because the frescoes at Knossos did not paint themselves. Someone mixed the pigments, someone prepared the wet plaster, someone climbed the scaffolding with a steady hand and a reed brush and created images of such astonishing life, such fluid grace, such startling modernity, that when Arthur Evans, the wealthy, obsessive, half-blind English archaeologist who excavated Knossos beginning in 1900, when Arthur Evans first saw the fragments emerging from the Cretan soil, he gasped. He literally gasped. His field notes record the moment. The earth peeled back, and there, still clinging to a chunk of fallen wall, was a painted figure, a young man, life-sized, in profile, as was the Minoan convention, but rendered with a naturalism that Evans had never seen in anything this old. The flesh was reddish-brown, the hair was black, elaborately curled, falling in a long lock past the ear.
And the eye, the single visible eye, was painted with an almond-shaped precision that Evans, who had spent years studying the stiff, hieratic art of Egypt and the Near East, found almost shockingly alive. He called the figure the cupbearer. It was approximately 3,400 years old, and it looked like it had been painted yesterday. This is the magic of true fresco, fresco buono, as the Italian Renaissance masters would later call it. You paint onto wet lime plaster. The pigment bonds chemically with the calcium carbonate as it dries. The color doesn't sit on the surface, it becomes the surface, it becomes the wall itself. And if that wall survives, if earthquake and fire and time and rain don't destroy it utterly, the color endures with a luminosity that no other painting technique can match. The painter knew this. She knew it in her hands, the way a potter knows clay, the way a sailor knows wind. She knew exactly how wet the plaster needed to be. She knew how quickly she had to work. True fresco is unforgiving. Once the plaster begins to set, you cannot correct, you cannot paint over, you cannot hesitate. Every stroke must be confident. Every line must be right the first time. Look at her work. Look at the dolphins. The dolphin fresco from the Queen's Megaron, if it was a Queen's Megaron, if the Minoans had queens in any sense we would recognize, and these are questions we will grapple with. The dolphin fresco shows 3 blue dolphins swimming through an underwater world of sea urchins, sponges, and small fish. The dolphins are rendered with a naturalistic accuracy that suggests hours of close observation. The curve of the dorsal fin, the specific patterning of the tail fluke, the sense of fluid, joyful motion, these dolphins are playing. They are not symbolic, they are not hieratic, they are alive. 1,300 years before classical Athens, 1,700 years before the mosaics of Rome, 3,000 years before Botticelli, the painter, or the tradition the painter belonged to, was doing something that no one else in the Bronze Age world was doing. She was painting life as it moved. Let us go back, further back, before the palace, before the frescoes, before any of it. Crete was first settled around 7,000 BCE, the early Neolithic, by people who probably crossed from Anatolia, modern Turkey, bringing with them the seeds of wheat and barley, the knowledge of animal husbandry, and the spiritual practices of the Near Eastern farming revolution. For nearly 4,000 years, these early Cretans lived in small agricultural communities. They made pottery. They buried their dead in communal tombs.
They worshipped, as far as we can tell, in caves and on mountain peaks, leaving behind small clay figurines of humans and animals, votive offerings of extraordinary simplicity and power. And then, around 3000 BCE, something changed. The archaeological record shows a sudden acceleration. New materials appear: bronze, gold, silver. New techniques: sophisticated pottery production, gem cutting, metalworking of astonishing precision. New architectural forms: large communal buildings oriented around central courtyards. Trade goods from Egypt, from the Levant, from the Cycladic Islands. Something catalyzed. Was it contact with Egypt, whose old kingdom was just reaching its pyramid-building zenith? Was it the development of maritime technology, larger ships, better sails that opened the sea routes? Was it some internal social revolution, a new form of political or religious organization that concentrated resources and labor? We don't know. The locked door of Linear A keeps its secrets. But by approximately 1950 BCE, the Cretans, the people we now call Minoans, after the mythological king Minos, a name imposed by Arthur Evans, a name the Minoans themselves never used, the Minoans were building palaces. Not one palace, several. Knossos, the largest, in the north center of the island, controlling the most fertile agricultural plain in Crete. Phaistos, in the south, overlooking the Massara Plain and the Libyan Sea. Mallia, on the northeast coast, with its famous gold bee pendant, two bees facing each other over a honeycomb, a piece of jewelry so exquisitely crafted that it remains one of the supreme achievements of ancient goldsmithing. Zakros, in the Far East, the gateway to Egypt and the Levant. 4 great palaces, perhaps more that we haven't found. Each one organized around the same basic principle: a large central courtyard oriented north-south, surrounded by a labyrinthine complex of storerooms, workshops, ritual spaces, residential quarters, and administrative offices. Labyrinthine, that word. You know where it comes from, don't you? Labyrinthos, the labyrinth. The mythological maze built by the master craftsman Daedalus at the command of King Minos to contain the Minotaur, the monstrous offspring of Minos' wife Pasiphae and a divine bull. A half-human, half-bovine creature that fed on the flesh of Athenian youths and maidens sent as tribute from a conquered Athens, until the hero Theseus penetrated the maze, slew the monster, and escaped by following a thread given to him by Minos' daughter, Ariadne. Ariadne's thread. Every element of this myth, every single element, has a plausible root in Minoan reality. The labyrinth? Walk through the ruins of Knossos. The interconnected rooms, the corridors that turn without warning, the multiple levels, the disorienting absence of a clear central axis. It is the labyrinth. It is the labyrinth. The word labyrinthos may derive from labrys, the double-headed axe that is the single most ubiquitous symbol in Minoan iconography. Double axes carved in stone.
Double axes cast in bronze and gold. Double axes painted on walls and incised on pillars. The house of the double axe. The labyrinth. The Minotaur. The bull-leaping frescoes show young athletes, male and female if the color conventions are consistent, grasping the horns of a charging bull, somersaulting over its back and landing behind it.
Whether this was an actual physical practice or a ritual idealization, the centrality of the bull to Minoan religion is undeniable. Bulls' heads carved in stone with crystal eyes, rhytons, ritual drinking vessels in the shape of bulls' heads, bull horns crowning every sacred building, a civilization obsessed with bulls centered in a maze-like palace. The myth writes itself. The tribute? The later Greeks preserved a tradition that Athens had once been subject to Crete. Given the overwhelming naval power of Minoan civilization, their thalassocracy, their command of the sea, this is entirely plausible. Tribute of goods, of labor, perhaps even of people, flowing from weaker Aegean communities to the palace centers of Crete. Ariadne? Her name may derive from a Cretan word meaning most holy. She may be a faded memory of a Minoan goddess or of a high priestess who served that goddess. The thread she gives Theseus, the clue, from the Latin cluvis, meaning a ball of thread, the thread that allows navigation of the labyrinth, may encode a real practice, may encode the memory of a ritual passage through the palace guided by an initiate. Myth is memory, distorted, compressed, ornamented, transformed by centuries of retelling, but memory. And the Minoans left myths so powerful that they survived the total destruction of the civilization that created them. That is extraordinary. That is almost without parallel. The painter works in the palace during what archaeologists call the Neo-Palatial period, roughly 1700 to 1450 BCE. This is the zenith. This is the golden age. The earlier palaces, the proto-palatial structures built around 1950 BCE, were destroyed, probably by earthquake, around 1700 BCE. Crete sits at the collision point of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. Earthquakes are not occasional events, they are structural features of existence. The Minoans knew this, they built with it. Their architecture incorporates wooden beams into the masonry, not because they lacked sufficient stone, but because wood flexes. Wood absorbs seismic energy. Wood prevents the rigid, catastrophic failure that pure stone construction suffers in an earthquake. This is sophisticated engineering. This is the engineering of a people who have been knocked down before and intend to get back up. And they did get back up. After the destruction of 1700 BCE, the palaces were rebuilt, larger, more complex, more beautiful than before. Knossos, in its Neo-Palatial phase, is the largest Bronze Age building in Europe.
It may house several thousand people. Its storerooms contain massive clay pithoi, storage jars taller than a person, filled with olive oil, wine, grain. The economic surplus is staggering. The administrative complexity implied by the linear A tablets, inventory records, transaction logs, the bureaucratic machinery of a redistributive economy suggests a level of organizational sophistication comparable to contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. But the feel is different. The painter knows this. She feels it every time she climbs the scaffolding, every time she mixes her pigments, every time she touches brush to wet plaster. In Egypt, art serves the state. Art serves eternity. The pharaoh must be depicted according to strict canonical proportions, broad shoulders, narrow waist, left foot forward, the same pose for 3,000 years. Deviation is not creativity. Deviation is heresy. Egyptian art is magnificent, awe-inspiring, technically supreme, and deliberately, intentionally unchanging. That is the point. That is the theological mandate. The pharaoh is eternal. Art must reflect eternity. In Mesopotamia, art serves power. The great reliefs of Assyrian palaces, which come later than the Minoan period but illustrate the principle, show kings hunting lions, kings defeating enemies, kings receiving tribute. The purpose is intimidation. The message is submission. Minoan art serves what? Joy? Is that too simple? Is that naive? Let me look at the evidence. The frescoes show dolphins playing, swallows darting over lilies, monkeys climbing rocks, blue monkeys, fantastical and delightful, octopuses spreading their tentacles across the surfaces of ceramic vessels with a fluid grace that turns a storage jar into a meditation on the beauty of marine life. Young women with elaborate hairstyles and knowing expressions. La Parisienne, Evans called one of them, because she looked to him like a fashionable French woman of his own era, and the name stuck because it captured something real, a sophistication, a self-awareness, an almost modern sensibility. Processions, yes. Rituals, yes. But not the rituals of conquest, not the rituals of domination. Rituals of offering, rituals of communion with the natural world. Rituals centered on, and this is one of the most fascinating and contentious aspects of Minoan studies, rituals centered on female divinity. The Minoan goddess, or goddesses, the scholarly debate continues. She appears everywhere. In the small faience figurines from Knossos, the famous snake goddess, bare-breasted, holding serpents in both outstretched hands, wearing a tiered skirt and an elaborate headdress, staring forward with an expression of absolute, terrifying authority. In the gold signet rings that show female figures receiving worship in outdoor sanctuaries. In the frescoes that depict women, always women, presiding over ritual events, seated on thrones, receiving offerings. Where are the kings? This is the question that haunts Minoan archaeology. Evans assumed there must be kings.
He was a man of his era, Victorian, patriarchal, steeped in the assumptions of classical scholarship. He called the largest room in Knossos the throne room, and assumed the stone seat within it, still in situ, still flanked by painted griffins, was the seat of King Minos. But the room is small, intimate, more like a chapel than a throne room. And the griffins, mythological creatures associated elsewhere in the Bronze Age Aegean with female divinity, suggest that whoever sat on that throne may not have been a king at all, may have been a priestess, may have been a queen, may have been something for which we have no adequate word, a figure combining religious authority, political power, and ritual function in a configuration that our categories cannot easily accommodate. The painter paints what she sees, and what she sees again and again are women at the center of things, women gathering saffron, women pouring libations, women seated in the front rows of the bull-leaping spectacle while men leap, women with their breasts bared, not in the sexualized way a modern viewer might assume, but in a gesture of ritual power, of sacred exposure, of divine identification. The goddess bares her breasts. The priestess bares her breasts. The two are perhaps the same. I am not saying the Minoans were a matriarchy. That claim has been made enthusiastically and repeatedly since the 1970s, and it outstrips the evidence. What the evidence does support, what the art, the religious iconography, the architectural layout, and the burial practices collectively suggest, is a society in which women held a degree of public, ritual, and possibly political authority that was extraordinary by the standards of the Bronze Age, by the standards of most of human history. The painter knows this. The painter lives it. She works alongside other painters, male and female, as far as we can determine from the few skeletal analyses of paint-stained burials. The workshop tradition at Knossos spans generations. Master teaches apprentice. Techniques are transmitted, refined, evolved. The style changes subtly over centuries. Earlier frescoes are more geometric, more stylized,
Later frescoes achieved the extraordinary naturalism that stunned Arthur Evans. But the core aesthetic remains constant: fluidity, movement, life, color, always color. The painter grinds her own pigments: red from hematite, iron oxide, the blood of the earth; blue from a copper-based compound, possibly Egyptian blue, imported along the trade routes that connect Crete to the Nile Delta; yellow from ochre or from saffron itself, the precious spice that Crete produces and exports across the Mediterranean; black from carbon, burned bone, burned wood; white from lime. These are the colors of the Minoan world, and she applies them in a manner that is uniquely, unmistakably Minoan.
The convention for skin color: reddish-brown for men, white for women. The same convention used in Egyptian art, suggesting cultural exchange or shared heritage. The convention for the eye, always depicted frontally, even in a profile face, the same convention that would persist through Greek vase painting and into Byzantine iconography. The convention for hair, elaborate, curled, flowing, a society that clearly invested enormous care in personal grooming. But within these conventions, the painter finds freedom. Watch her paint the bull leapers. The Toreador fresco, perhaps the single most famous image from Minoan civilization. A great bull charges forward, its body stretched in full gallop. At its horns, a figure grasps, the moment of contact, the split second before the acrobat's body swings upward. Over the bull's back, a second figure is mid-somersault, inverted, airborne, suspended between danger and grace. Behind the bull, a third figure has landed, arms outstretched, triumphant, alive. Is it possible? Physically, can a human being grasp the horns of a charging bull and vault over its back? Modern rodeo athletes say no. The force involved would break arms, dislocate shoulders, kill. But the Minoans painted it with such specificity, such anatomical precision. The musculature of the athletes, the posture of the bull, the sequential phases of the leap depicted as if in a motion study, that it's difficult to dismiss it as pure fantasy. Perhaps the bulls were trained. Perhaps the leap was from a standing start, not a full charge. Perhaps there was an element of theatrical staging that made the impossible merely improbable. Perhaps some leapers died, and perhaps that was part of the point. Sacrifice, risk, the ultimate offering of the human body to the divine power embodied in the bull. The painter paints what she has seen in the central courtyard. She has seen the leapers train. She has seen them practice on wooden frameworks. She has seen them enter the courtyard, nearly naked, oiled, their hair bound up, their bodies taut with the knowledge of what is about to happen. She has seen the bull released, enormous, its horns sharpened, its eyes rolling. She has seen the leap. She has seen the leap fail. She does not paint the failures. That is a choice, and it tells us something. Minoan art does not depict suffering. It does not depict warfare. It does not depict defeat or subjugation or punishment. This is not because the Minoans did not experience these things. No human society is free of violence. No civilization achieves peace without cost. It is because the Minoans chose to surround themselves with images of beauty, grace, natural splendor, and ritual power. The art is aspirational. The art shows the world as it should be.
And that choice, that deliberate, consistent, centuries-long aesthetic choice, tells us more about the Minoan soul than any deciphered text ever could. The sea. We must talk about the sea. The Minoans were, above all else, a maritime civilization. Crete sits at the crossroads of three continents: Europe to the north, Africa to the south, Asia to the east.
The island's position made it the natural hub of Eastern Mediterranean trade, and the Minoans exploited this advantage with a thoroughness and a boldness that prefigured the later Phoenicians. Minoan ships have been found depicted on seals, on pottery, on frescoes. They are sleek, crescent-shaped vessels, some oar-powered, some with square sails. The miniature fresco from Akrotiri, the Minoan settlement on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, shows an entire fleet, dozens of ships sailing between two coastal cities in what appears to be a ritual procession or a military expedition, or perhaps both at once. Akrotiri. We need to talk about Akrotiri, but the story demands that we build to it, because Akrotiri is where the painter's world begins to end. First, the reach. Minoan trade goods have been found in Egypt. In tomb paintings at Thebes, Minoan emissaries are depicted bringing gifts to the pharaoh. The Egyptians called them Keftiu, the people from Crete. Minoan pottery appears in the Levant, in Cyprus, in mainland Greece, in Sicily, in the Lipari Islands off southern Italy. Cretan bronze tools and weapons circulated throughout the Aegean. Minoan artistic influence, the fluid naturalistic style, the marine motifs, the specific conventions of figure painting can be traced across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. And the trade went both ways. Egyptian stone vessels in Knossos, Mesopotamian cylinder seals adapted to Minoan tastes, tin from the Western Mediterranean, essential for the bronze alloy that gave the age its name, copper from Cyprus, gold from Egypt and Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, traveling through multiple intermediary hands across thousands of miles. The Minoans sat at the center of a web, and they defended that web not with armies. There are no Minoan military fortifications on Crete, no evidence of a standing army, but with their navy. The ancient Greek historian Thucydides, writing over 1,000 years after the Minoan peak, recorded a tradition that King Minos was the first ruler to establish a thalassocracy, a rule of the sea. Minos cleared the Aegean of pirates, Thucydides wrote. He established Cretan colonies on the islands. He made the sea safe for trade. This tradition, like the myth of the labyrinth, almost certainly encodes a real historical memory. The Minoans controlled the sea. The sea made them rich. Their richness made them powerful.
Their power expressed itself not through conquest and empire, not in the way that Egypt or Mesopotamia or later Rome would understand those terms, but through cultural influence so pervasive that archaeologists have a term for it: Minoanization. The Cycladic islands, Thera, Melos, Naxos, Paros, became, by the Neopalatial period, essentially Minoan in character. Minoan-style architecture, Minoan-style frescoes, Minoan-style pottery, Minoan-style religious practices. Whether this was colonization, cultural assimilation, or voluntary adoption by local elites eager to participate in Minoan prestige networks, or some combination of all three, the result was the same. The Minoan world was not confined to Crete. The Minoan world was the Aegean. The painter has a daughter. I don't know this for certain. No text confirms it. But the fresco workshops at Knossos show continuity of style over generations, and the most logical mechanism for that continuity, in a world without academies, without printed manuals, without any institutional framework for artistic education, is family transmission. Mother teaches daughter, father teaches son. The craft stays in the blood. So the painter has a daughter, and the daughter learns. She learns to prepare plaster, the specific ratio of lime to sand, the precise amount of water, the critical window of workability. She learns to grind pigments, to test their consistency on a shard of pottery before committing them to the wall. She learns the conventions, the canonical proportions of the human figure, the symbolic color codes, the
the repertoire of approved motifs: lilies, crocuses, dolphins, bulls, griffins, the double axe, the figure-8 shield, the sacred horns. But most importantly, she learns to see. The painter teaches her daughter to see the way the light falls through the light wells at different times of day, and how the fresco must account for this, how a figure painted in a north-facing corridor will need different values, different intensities than a figure painted in a sun-drenched portico. She teaches her to see the movement of water, the particular way a dolphin's body curves at the apex of a leap, the spray pattern, the light refraction. She teaches her to see fabric, the weight and drape of a Minoan flounced skirt, the way it moves as the wearer walks, the way it catches light differently at each fold. This is knowledge. This is not instinct, not talent alone, but accumulated, transmitted, refined knowledge, the product of centuries of careful observation and technical experimentation within a living artistic tradition. And this knowledge is about to be tested by fire.
Yes, Mother.
Thera. The island of Thera, modern Santorini, lies approximately 110 kilometers north of Crete. In the 17th century BCE, it is home to a thriving Minoan settlement at Akrotiri. The town has 2-story and 3-story houses with indoor plumbing.
It has sophisticated frescoes, some of the finest in the entire Minoan world. It has workshops, storerooms, a complex street plan, and it sits on a volcano. The eruption of Thera, the date is debated. The current best estimates center on approximately 1628 BCE or 1530 BCE, a 100-year discrepancy that drives volcanologists and archaeologists to distraction. The eruption of Thera was one of the most powerful volcanic events in human history. The volcanic explosivity index rates it at 7 out of 8. To put that in perspective, the eruption of Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii in 79 CE was a 5. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which was heard 3,000 miles away and caused global climate disruption, was a 6. Thera was 10 times more powerful than Krakatoa. The eruption column reached approximately 36 kilometers into the stratosphere. It deposited volcanic ash across an area of hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Ash from the Theran eruption has been identified in ice cores from Greenland, in lake sediments in Turkey, in deep-sea cores throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The center of the island collapsed into the volcanic caldera, creating the distinctive crescent shape that Santorini bears today, a drowned crater, the sea pouring in to fill the void left by the mountain that used to be there. And the collapse generated tsunamis. The modeling is imprecise, but the estimates are terrifying. Waves 30 meters high, possibly higher, radiating outward from the caldera. The north coast of Crete, 110 kilometers to the south, would have been struck within 30 to 60 minutes of the caldera collapse. 30-meter waves hitting a coastline lined with harbors, shipyards, warehouses, and settlements. The Minoan Navy. The Minoan Navy was in those harbors. The destruction was not instant, and it was not total. This is important. The Thera eruption did not end Minoan civilization in a single apocalyptic stroke. That is the dramatic narrative, the Atlantis narrative, and it is too simple. What the eruption did was wound. The tsunamis devastated the north coast of Crete and the Minoan settlements throughout the southern Aegean. The ashfall, centimeters to tens of centimeters thick, depending on location and wind patterns, damaged crops across eastern Crete. The volcanic winter, the global cooling caused by sulfur aerosols in the stratosphere, may have disrupted agriculture for years. But Knossos survived. The palace was too far inland, too elevated to be touched by the tsunami.
The ashfall in central Crete was survivable. The Minoans rebuilt. They recovered. Partially. Because here is what the eruption truly destroyed. It destroyed the perception of Minoan invulnerability. For centuries, the Minoans had dominated the Aegean through naval supremacy and cultural prestige. They had no defensive walls because they needed no defensive walls. The sea was their wall.
Their fleet was their army. After Thera, the fleet was diminished. The maritime network was disrupted. The subject peoples of the Aegean islands, people who had adopted Minoan customs, Minoan religion, Minoan art, began to look elsewhere for leadership. They looked north. They looked to the Greek mainland. They looked to Mycenae. The Mycenaeans. We need to be precise about who the Mycenaeans were, because the relationship between Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece is one of the most complex cultural dynamics in ancient history. The Mycenaeans were Greek speakers. They arrived on the Greek mainland during the Middle Bronze Age, bringing with them an Indo-European language that would eventually evolve into Classical Greek and ultimately into the language spoken in Athens and Thessaloniki today. They were warriors. Their citadels, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, were heavily fortified. Their graves contained weapons. Their art depicted combat, hunting, siege warfare. They were everything the Minoans were not, and they were utterly enthralled by Minoan culture. This is one of history's great paradoxes, a warrior society looking south across the Aegean at a civilization that did not fortify its cities, that depicted dolphins and flowers instead of battles, that may have placed women at the center of its religious life, and choosing not to conquer it, not immediately, but to imitate it. Mycenaean art in its early phases is essentially a copy of Minoan art. Mycenaean pottery adopts Minoan marine motifs. Mycenaean frescoes, and this is critical, were almost certainly painted by Minoan artists or artists trained in Minoan workshops. The fresco fragments from Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes show unmistakable Minoan technique and Minoan style. The painter may have trained some of these artists, or the painter's daughter may have. The transmission of Minoan artistic knowledge to the Greek mainland is one of the great cultural transfers of the Bronze Age, and it happened through real people, painters, potters, metalworkers, seal cutters, moving from Crete to Greece, carrying their skills with them. But the Mycenaeans were not content to remain students forever. Around 1450 BCE, a date that archaeology fixes with reasonable precision based on destruction layers and pottery sequences, something happened on Crete, something violent. Every major Minoan center except Knossos was destroyed. Phaistos burned, Melia burned, Zakros burned so suddenly that valuable objects were left behind, ritual vessels, bronze tools, the stores of the palace, as if the inhabitants fled or were overwhelmed too quickly to salvage anything. Only Knossos survived. And when Knossos emerged from this catastrophe, it was different. The administrative language changed. Linear A, the undeciphered Minoan script, was replaced by Linear B, and Linear B, when Michael Ventris finally deciphered it in 1952, turned out to be Greek. Greek. The palace of Knossos was now administered by Greek speakers, Mycenaean Greeks. Warriors from the mainland who had crossed the sea and taken control of the greatest palace in the Aegean. Was it invasion, conquest, a coup d'etat by a Mycenaean faction already present in the Minoan court? A palace revolution supported by external force? The evidence permits multiple interpretations, and scholars have argued all of them. But the result is clear.
Minoan civilization as an independent cultural entity ended around 1450 BCE. The palaces were gone, all except Knossos, which persisted as a Mycenaean administrative center for perhaps another 50 to 75 years before it too was destroyed, probably by fire, around 1375 BCE. After that, silence. The writing stops, the frescoes stop, the great palatial workshops fall silent. The trade networks, already fraying, collapse entirely. Crete becomes a provincial backwater of the Mycenaean world, and the painter's tradition dies. Or does it? Here is where the story becomes something more than archaeology. Here is where it becomes a meditation on what survives and how and why. The Minoans disappeared. Their language was lost. Their script remains unread. Their cities crumbled. Their religion was absorbed and transformed by the Mycenaeans, who took the Minoan goddess and fractured her into the multiple goddesses of the Greek pantheon: Athena, Artemis, Aphrodite, Demeter, Hera, each one carrying fragments of the original Minoan divinity like shards of a broken mirror. But the aesthetic survived. The painter's way of seeing, the fluidity, the love of natural forms, the sense of movement and life entered Greek art through the Mycenaean transmission and never fully left. When Greek vase painters, 7 centuries after the fall of Knossos, depicted dolphins and octopuses with that same fluid grace, they were drawing on a tradition that reached back through layers of cultural memory to the wet plaster walls of the Minoan palace. When the sculptors of the Parthenon carved the flowing robes of the Panathenaic procession with that extraordinary sense of fabric in motion, they were solving the same problem the painter had solved 1,000 years earlier: how to make stone or plaster capture the momentary, the fleeting, the alive. The thread was never fully broken, Ariadne's thread. And then there is Atlantis. We must address it because the connection between Minoan Crete and Plato's Atlantis is one of the most persistent and seductive ideas in the history of speculation about the ancient world. Plato described Atlantis in 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. A great island civilization, wealthy beyond measure, technologically advanced, spiritually refined, and destroyed in a single day of catastrophic natural disaster, sinking beneath the waves. The parallels with Minoan Crete are obvious: an island civilization, maritime supremacy, bull rituals. Plato specifically describes the Atlanteans performing bull sacrifices in their great temple. Sudden destruction, disappearance.
Did Plato know about the Minoans? Not directly. By Plato's time, the Minoan civilization had been gone for over 1,000 years, and no written record of it survived in Greek literature. But oral traditions endure: the myths of Minos, of the labyrinth, of the thalassocracy. These were alive in Plato's Athens. And Egyptian records, which Plato claims as his source, may have preserved memories of the Keftiu, the people from Crete, and of the catastrophic eruption that devastated their world. Is Atlantis a memory of Minoan Crete, distorted by a millennium of retelling? Possibly. Probably not exactly. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian, and Atlantis served a philosophical purpose in his dialogues, a moral fable about the corruption of an ideal society. But the resonance is there. The echo is unmistakable. A brilliant island civilization, bull worship, naval supremacy, no fortifications, sudden catastrophic destruction. The Minoans didn't sink beneath the waves, but in every other respect, in every respect that matters to the human imagination,
They vanished just as completely, and the story of their vanishing became one of the foundational myths of Western civilization. The painter's last fresco. I'm inventing this. I acknowledge that. I am constructing a moment that no archaeological evidence directly supports, because the evidence has been burned and buried and scattered and lost, and sometimes the only honest response to absence is imagination grounded in everything we do know. She is old now, old by Bronze Age standards, which means perhaps 50, perhaps 55. Her hands are stiff in the mornings. The pigment stains have become permanent. Her fingertips are ochre and blue, as if the earth and the sea have claimed her one digit at a time. The palace is not what it was. She can feel it. Everyone can feel it. The trade ships come less frequently. The storerooms are not as full. The rituals continue, but there is a quality of anxiety in them that was not there before, a tightness, a desperation, as if the gestures that once invited the goddess's presence are now begging for it. The Mycenaeans are in the palace, not as conquerors, not yet, as guests, as traders, as diplomatic visitors, as young men sent to learn. They speak a language the painter does not understand, a harsh northern tongue full of consonant clusters that grate against her Cretan ear. They are taller than Cretan men. They carry weapons openly, bronze swords with hilts wrapped in leather, and they wear them with a casual familiarity that makes the painter uneasy. They want frescoes. They want the painter, or artists like her, to come to the mainland and paint their halls. They want the dolphins and the lilies and the bowl leapers. They want the beauty. They want the prestige.
They want the surface of what the painter creates, without understanding what lies beneath it. Because beneath the dolphins and the lilies, beneath the saffron gatherers and the sacred processions, beneath all the beauty and color and fluid grace, beneath all of it is a way of being in the world, a relationship with the natural environment, the sea, the earth, the animals, the plants, that the painter's civilization cultivated for over 1,000 years. A relationship in which the human and the natural are not opposed, but integrated, in which art is not decoration, but devotion, in which beauty is not luxury, but necessity, as necessary as bread, as water, as breath. The Mycenaeans see the art. They do not see the devotion. They see the power. They do not see the prayer. And when they finally come, when they come not as guests but as masters, when they burn Phaistos and Malia and Zakros, when they install themselves in Knossos and replace the sacred script with their own, they will keep the art, they will keep the dolphins on the walls, but the prayer will be gone. The painter finishes her last fresco on a spring morning when the light through the western light well falls at exactly the angle she loves, golden, warm, turning the wet plaster into a mirror. She is painting lilies, white lilies against a red background. The stems curve with a naturalism that can only come from a lifetime of looking at lilies, real lilies, growing in the palace gardens, fed by the hydraulic system that channels mountain spring water through the palace complex. The petals are white. The stamens are saffron yellow. The leaves are the green of new growth. She paints the way she has always painted, quickly, confidently, each stroke placed once and left. The plaster is setting. She can feel it under her brush, the surface changing from wet to firm, the pigment locking in. In an hour, the plaster will be dry and the lilies will be permanent. They will be part of the wall. They will last as long as the wall lasts. She does not know how long that will be. She does not know that in a year, or 10 years, or 50 years, the chronology is uncertain, this wall will burn, that the palace will fall, that the garden will be abandoned,
and the spring water will flow unused, and the lilies will grow wild among the ruins. She does not know that 34 centuries later, a half-blind English archaeologist will find fragments of this plaster in the Cretan soil, small pieces, no larger than a hand, still bearing traces of pigment, red, white, yellow, green, and will recognize them as flowers.
She does not know any of this. She knows the plaster, she knows the brush, she knows the lilies. She paints. Arthur Evans arrived on Crete in March 1900. He was 50 years old. He was wealthy. His father had been a successful industrialist and a noted antiquarian. He was educated, Harrow, Oxford, the Ashmolean Museum where he served as keeper. He was driven by a specific obsession, the small carved stones, seal stones, that he had seen in antique shops in Athens, stones bearing strange pictographic symbols that belonged to no known writing system. The locals told him the stones came from Crete. He went to Crete. The site of Knossos was not unknown. The great Cretan archaeologist Minos Kalokerinos had dug exploratory trenches there in 1878 and had found storerooms full of giant pithoi, the massive clay storage jars. Heinrich Schliemann, fresh from his triumph at Troy and Mycenae, had attempted to purchase the site in the 1880s but failed to agree on a price with the Turkish landowner. Crete was still under Ottoman rule. Evans succeeded where Schliemann had failed. He purchased the site. He hired local workers. He began to dig. Within days, he knew he had found something extraordinary. The palace emerged from the earth with a speed and a completeness that astonished even Evans. Room after room, corridor after corridor, storerooms lined with pithoi still standing in rows, the throne room with its stone seat and its painted griffins, the grand staircase descending 4 stories into the earth, its columns tapered downward, wider at the top than at the bottom, the distinctive inverted taper of Minoan architecture still standing. And the frescoes. The cupbearer, the dolphin fresco, the bull leaper, the ladies in blue, La Parisienne, the saffron gatherer, the prince of lilies. Fragment after fragment emerging from the soil like messages in bottles thrown across 35 centuries of silence. Evans wept. He wept, and then he did something controversial, something that has divided archaeologists ever since. He reconstructed. Using the surviving fragments as guides, Evans hired artists, the Swiss father and son team, Émile Gilleron père and Émile Gilleron fils, to recreate the frescoes as they might have looked when intact. He rebuilt sections of the palace in reinforced concrete, painting them in the bright Minoan colors. He restored the columns, the staircases, the light wells. The result is Knossos as we see it today, part authentic ruin, part Edwardian interpretation. A palimpsest, a collaboration across millennia between the Minoan builders and an English dreamer who wanted, desperately, to make the past visible again. Scholars have criticized Evans for over-restoring, for imposing his assumptions on the evidence, for creating a Knossos that is more Evans than Minoan. And these criticisms have merit. His reconstructions do reflect his era's aesthetics.
His interpretations do reflect his biases, the assumption of kingship, the patriarchal framework, the Art Nouveau sensibility that colors the Gilleron's restorations. But without Evans, Knossos would be a field of low walls and broken foundations, incomprehensible to any visitor without advanced archaeological training. Without Evans, the Minoans would remain an abstraction, a name in a textbook, a footnote in the history of Greece. Evans made the Minoans visible. He made them real. He made a civilization that had been dead for 3,500 years breathe again. and in doing so, imperfectly, controversially, with all the limitations of his era and his personality, he completed the painter's work. She painted on wet plaster so that the pigment would become the wall. He dug through dry earth so that the wall would become memory. Between the two of them, the anonymous Cretan woman with ochre-stained fingers and the half-blind English gentleman with a trowel, between the two of them, they ensured that the dolphins still swim, the lilies still bloom, the bull leapers still fly. Close your eyes now. I mean it this time. Close your eyes and picture the palace of Knossos. Not as a ruin, not as a reconstruction. Picture it as it was, 1,500 years before Christ. A spring morning, the light pouring through the light wells in golden columns. The columns themselves painted red, tapering downward in that impossible inverted shape, catching the light and throwing warm shadows across painted walls. The frescoes alive with color, dolphins leaping, lilies blooming, young men and women processing toward the central courtyard where the great ritual is about to begin. The sound of drums, the sound of lyres. The Minoans played lyres, we know this from the frescoes. The sound of bare feet on polished gypsum floors, the rustle of flounced skirts, the clink of gold jewelry, earrings, necklaces, bracelets, armbands. The Minoans adorned themselves lavishly, and the craftsmanship of their gold work has never been surpassed. The smell of burning olive oil in the ritual lamps, the smell of saffron, the smell of the sea, always the sea, because on Crete you are never far from the sea, and the salt wind finds its way into every corridor, every courtyard, every room. And in a small chamber off the western corridor, the painter is mixing pigment, ochre and lime, blue copper and water, saffron and egg white. She tests a brush stroke on a shard. She approves. She turns to the wet wall. She begins. And somewhere, in a museum in Heraklion, in a reconstructed room at Knossos, in a photograph in a book, on a screen you are looking at right now, somewhere, the stroke she is about to make still exists, still vibrant, still alive.
Because true fresco doesn't fade. The pigment becomes the wall becomes the earth becomes the memory, and memory, human memory, cultural memory, the memory we carry in our myths and our museums and our persistent, irrational, beautiful refusal to let the dead stay dead. Memory becomes immortality. The Minoans knew this. They knew it in their bones, in their pigments, in every lilies they painted, and every bull they leaped, and every prayer they offered to the bare-breasted goddess who held the serpents of earth and time in her outstretched hands. They knew that the body dies, but the image endures, that the voice falls silent, but the color sings, that civilizations crumble, but beauty, real beauty, beauty made with skill and devotion and love, beauty outlasts everything. Everything, even the sea that swallowed Thera, even the fire that burned the palaces, even the silence that followed. The painter's hands are gone, but her lilies are still blooming. Her dolphins are still leaping. Her bull leapers are still suspended in mid-flight, frozen in that impossible moment between the horns and the sky, between danger and grace, between the human and the divine, still flying. After all this time, still flying. And if you go to Crete, if you stand in the ruins of Knossos on a spring morning when the light falls just right and the tourists haven't arrived yet, and the wind carries the scent of wild thyme from the hills, if you stand there and you are very still and very quiet, you can feel her.
the painter, still working, still choosing the next color, still placing the brush against the wet plaster with a confidence born of centuries of tradition and a lifetime of devoted practice, still painting the world as it should be, as it was, as, in the fragments that survive, it forever is.